Welcome to Writer Spark, the podcast with tips and tricks about fiction writing. I'm your host, Melissa Bourbon, national best-selling author, developmental fiction editor, writing coach, and instructor. When I started my writing journey, learning about the industry and the craft of writing wasn't as easy as it is now. I wish I knew then what I know now, and that is what Writer Spark is all about. I'm paying it forward, so to speak. I want new and aspiring authors to learn from those who came before and who are living the writing life. That's what this podcast is all about. There are episodes on craft topics, and there are conversations with authors because I strongly believe we learn from each other. Wherever you are on your writing path, Writer Spark is for you. Check out our courses on our website, www.writersparkacademy.com. And if you enjoy the Writer Spark podcast, please follow and share with your writing friends. Like and subscribe. Today, my guest is John DeDakis, author of the Lark Chadwick mysteries. John is a former editor on CNN's The Situation Room with Wolf Blitzer, and he's a former White House correspondent. His writing, both with plots and characters, reflects his time and experience as a journalist. Today, John and I are talking about writing from a perspective that's different from your own, whether that means gender, race, or ethnicity. John's protagonist, Lark, is a woman, and in book one, she is 22 years old, so very different from who he is. The old writing adage says to write what you know, but that's really not realistic, nor is it reflective of the world. So how do you really do that? And the answer is you don't. This is an interesting and important topic, and I hope you enjoy today's podcast. So grab a cup of something tasty, settle in, and get ready to ignite your writer spark. Thank you so much for joining me on the Writer Spark podcast, John DeDakis. Welcome.
Thanks, Melissa.
I am so glad that you're here with me, and I would love to just kind of launch in and hear a little bit about your origin story as a writer. Everybody comes to writing from sort of a different background, different perspective with different goals, and you've got a very illustrious career. So I'd like to hear how that led you to fiction writing.
Well, I didn't start out to be a writer. I started out actually to be a lawyer, and then I was going to use the law as a stepping stone to get into politics. And if my career trajectory had turned out the way I'd expected, I would have been, at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. For the good of the country, I decided to go in a different direction, ended up going into journalism back in the late 60s when the Vietnam War was in all the papers. It was a big deal. And I guess, I have about a 45-year career in journalism, but and everything was cruising along pretty well with that. I covered the White House. I went to CNN in 1988 as a writer, but I guess that I started to get really serious about writing fiction when CNN made me an editor. It paid better, but it was tedious. It was fault finding. And so I needed a creative outlet. And so I wrote a novel, as if it's that easy.
Right.
The first novel I wrote took 10 years to get the agent that I've got. It went through 14 major revisions, and she's the 39th agent that I queried. But I made a lot of mistakes along the way, and I tell my writing students, if you take good notes, I'll save you 9 years in the process.
Yeah.
And so I've written like 5 novels now. I'm working on my 6th, and I retired from CNN in 2013, 10 years ago. So I've basically glided into a new career.
Well, your 39th agent query, I feel like that's actually pretty good. There are people that send out 100 or more, and I don't know that I ever counted mine, but I feel like it was above the 50 mark. So 39, impressive.
Well, and impressive that you didn't give up. And that I think is often what happens. People get discouraged.
Yeah. In fact, I can't think of who said this quote, and I referenced it in a different podcast recently, but the difference between somebody who succeeds and somebody who fails is the person who succeeds never gave up.
That's it.
Yeah.
That's exactly it.
Well, so tell me a little bit about your novels before we jump into our topic.
I've written 5 mystery suspense thriller novels. I write in the first person as a young woman in her 20s. I'm neither of those. We can talk about that.
Right, that's
Um,
our topic. Uh-huh.
and she, I mean, you write what you know, and I mean, I think anybody who's written understands that. And I know journalism, so all of my novels have a journalism backdrop. And what ended up happening is that with the political climate the way it is, there are a lot of people who really think seriously that at CNN we sat around thinking, how are we going to get a Barack Obama elected president?
Hmm.
It is a firing offense to conduct your journalism that way or to make things up. So a lot of my novels, all of my novels, I think give people, especially people who know nothing about journalism, a glimpse behind the scenes as to how it's done.
That's interesting. And one of the things that you said that I read on your website is that your books maintain the concept of journalistic integrity and also the mentoring relationships, with I think is really important in terms of bringing up new journalists, right, with that sense of integrity and the sense of how it really should be done.
Exactly. And, my protagonist's name is Lark Chadwick, and her mentor is Lionel Stone. He's a former New York Times editor, Pulitzer Prize winner. He's retired to his home state of Wisconsin, where Lark comes across him because she has just had a major loss in her life. She's found the body of the aunt who raised her from infancy, and that trauma launches her on a search to find out more about the car accident that killed her parents. And so she gets a newspaper clipping and discovers, to her astonishment, that she is the miracle baby who survived a car train collision, but no one had ever told her.
Hmm.
So she convinces Lionel to let her do a follow up story. Two of her sources are the mayor and the sheriff of this small Wisconsin town. Each guy is running for Congress. The election is 1 week away, and each person has a secret that will unravel the mystery. And so, she and Lionel hires her to be a reporter, and her new career is launched.
Okay, interesting. So, our topic today is writing from a perspective different from your own, specifically a gender different from your own. But I do think that parlays into writing from other perspectives, whether that's race or ethnicity or I don't know, how whatever other perspectives there are. For example, I have a character who's Latina and I'm clearly not Latina. My husband is first generation Mexican American, and that character is much based on his family. So I feel like I
Mhm.
have this, real connection to that, which, in my mind makes that okay. But there
Right.
are people who don't feel that way. And when you're writing as a male from the perspective of a 20, what did you say, 25-year-old female?
She
I,
starts 22. Yeah.
okay, so what? First of all, what made you make that decision? And then let's just talk about the pros and the cons of that, and what's easy and what's difficult about that.
Fair enough. The reason I started writing as a woman was just when I started writing my first novel, someone suggested that I should write in a way that stretches who I am. Never been a woman, not in this life. So I gave it a try and discovered that it was more accessible than I expected, because I discovered emotions are not gender specific. We all have the exact same emotions. It's just that in my experience, the women in my life are more articulate about their emotions. They're more willing to share them. They draw from a more varied emotional palette. And when I was working at CNN for 25 years, that's 25 years worth of young women, mostly in their early to mid 20s, who were interns and new hires, and I'd talk to them about what it's like to be a woman. And they talk to me about their careers, their boyfriends, their girlfriends, their families, and I would listen, and I would just um, learn a lot about that. And then many of them became my beta readers. I discovered years later that there's a deeper reason I write as a woman. And this really goes to part of the creative process, which is your subconscious. And my youngest son died from a heroin overdose about 11 years ago, and I went through grief counseling, which any kind of a therapy situation is a great way to get to know yourself better. And so when they invited me, I went through for 2.5 years, and after I left grief counseling, they asked me to come back and give a speech for a fundraising banquet. As I was writing my speech, I realized that the deeper reason I write as a woman is that I'm trying to create a character I wish my sister had allowed herself to become. Because my sister was brilliant. Um, she could have been a concert pianist, she could have been a surgeon, but her husband basically said, "What would it look like, a football coach married to a surgeon?" And so one by one, she gave up her dreams, and 20 years later went into the garage, closed the door, turned on the ignition, and killed herself.
Oh my goodness.
And so that's the first chapter of my first novel. And it was a catharsis to write it, but I didn't realize until much later that Lark really is who Georgia could have been, because Lark doesn't let a guy define who she is. She's not a victim. She still falls for the bad boys, but she's got a little more spine, I guess, in being able to chart her own course. So it's a complicated explanation, but it really comes down to knowing yourself, being able to tap into your subconscious, and being open to the people around you, alert to your surroundings, your inner life, and then just plucking that from your subconscious.
Do you think that your choice to write as Lark, as this female, was in part to try to understand your sister's perspective and what she was going through?
I don't think so. I think that it was primarily, at least the first novel, was just trying to, for lack of a better word, memorialize that particular scene. I mean, I was on the scene the day she died, and so because it was such a profound experience, I was able to access it and write about it. But I don't think anything beyond that was going on. I think really what was going on is I wanted to write a book, and you write what you know, and so I was accessing what was familiar territory.
The decision to write as a female, was it, that's how it just came to you with the first book? Did you intend for this to be a series featuring the same character, or did that also evolve?
That evolved. I mean, I think, at least in my experience as a writing teacher and coach, I think a lot of people struggle with just that first book,
Mhm.
and often they feel like they've got to shoehorn all of their ideas into that one story,
Mhm.
and so then it gets to be 200,000 words long, and they wonder why nobody's accepting it. And so I discovered that you take a lot of those ideas and you put them aside for the next novel, and so it evolved into a series.
How has Lark's growth evolved along with the series and the mysteries that you develop that are, I imagine, somewhat independent of the one that was in the initial book connected to her aunt? It's hard to have characters evolve in general, especially when you really connect with them on certain levels. But as a male writing as a younger female, we want to see her evolve as a person, right, and grows. How does that work?
Well, it means that you need to have good beta readers in your life,
Mhm.
and the growth. I think it's a good idea to bake shortcomings into your protagonist,
Mhm.
and struggles, because chances are your protagonist is going to be drawn from yourself to a certain extent, and that you've got shortcomings and struggles and imperfections. So if you can bake some of those in, then you've got something to work with. And so in Lark's case, she's kind of impulsive, she's got anger issues, and so that gets her into a lot of trouble, and there's blowback, and so she's learned from the mistakes she's made, so that she still wrestles with some of those things, but she's learned to channel some of that anger as well. I gave a talk at a library once, and the librarian said that one of the things she liked about my stories is that Lark does evolve.
Mhm.
That there really is a growth arc that takes place in her character, which, coming from a librarian, really meant a lot.
Yeah. Does Lark age? How much does she age over the course of the 5 books you have so far?
She's not aged much.
Mhm.
She's 22 and she's 28 now in the 5th novel. Someone suggested early in the process, if you're going to write a series, don't have your protagonist be 80. Give her
Yeah.
a little room to grow. So, I made Lark nice and young, and uh, I see this going on for a long time.
Mhm. That's great. That's great. Yeah, I think that's so important. We've had conversations in the past, authors and myself, about how mysteries of the past, the Agatha Christie's, for example, the Rex Stouts, that they have sleuths who don't actually have much character growth, very little. And the books are very different than what we have now in the mystery genre, where the growth of the sleuth or the protagonist is equal to the mystery itself.
Yes, I think you've really nailed it. I think people read books in order to immerse themselves in the lives and problems of the protagonist. And so, in many cases, my novels really grow from something I'm wrestling with in my personal life. And I think that adds a richness to Lark's life that adds texture to the story.
Mhm.
Um, uh, and so I think by giving your protagonist a rich personal life just adds so much spice to a story.
Where does her name come from? The name Lark.
I have no idea. I really need to check my journals, but I have no idea. But Chadwick, interestingly, one of the before I started writing the novel, I was doing a writing exercise. And of course, a lot of prep work is involved in writing a novel, just to be able to understand what your story is going to be, who your characters are. So I was writing an exercise that was just a facts recitation of a car train collision that I witnessed when I was 9 years old. And I mean, I was in the dome car of this train, and we were going. I was near the front. I was able to see the tracks ahead, and out of the corner of my eye, this car came out of nowhere, crossed right in front of us. We hit him. All this debris comes down on the dome. We stopped. 3 people were killed in the car. And a woman who was on the train with me said, "Well, I live near here. I'll send you a newspaper clipping." 40 years later, I was still waiting for the newspaper clipping. And as I was writing this personal writing exercise, I remembered, this goes back to your subconscious again. I remembered a radio news report I heard the week after the accident, 40 years earlier, about a car train collision in which an infant survived. And I began to play what if. What if that kid grew up and wanted to find out more about her past? Well, as it turns out, um, Fast Track deals with such an accident, and it happened in the northern Illinois town of Chadwick, Illinois. So Lark is Lark Chadwick because of Chadwick, Illinois.
That's so interesting. I think that it's so cool to hear the stories that authors bring in from their personal lives and how those end up woven into, characters or plots or, a series as a whole. That's interesting. When I think of Lark, I mean, I hear the definition of Lark, which is kind of like I did something on a lark, like free and easy, and it almost creates this dichotomy within her, possibly.
Yes, she said that. In fact, in that first book, she said, really, my mom named me that because I was, as a baby, happy as a lark. But if
Mhm.
she were to name me now, it would be Basset Hound Chadwick.
That's good. That's clever. Okay, so part of what this podcast is about is offering sort of tips or tricks or just thoughts to new writers, to aspiring writers, to writers who want to continue to grow? Because I feel like we are always growing as writers, no
Yes.
matter where we are in our careers. And so I want to talk about, first of all, what were the easy things you encountered writing a protagonist of a different gender? And then what were some of the challenges, the biggest challenges that you encountered in this process and continue maybe to encounter in this process?
I think for me, writing dialogue comes easily because broadcast journalism is writing for the ear. So
Mm,
it's meant to be conversational. And so, probably the easiest thing for me then and now was writing dialogue. And so, a lot of my first drafts are almost exclusively dialogue.
mm,
If I can get characters talking to each other, then I can move the story along and things start happening. Hardest for me is description, and that happens in the rewrite. And of course, it always I get a laugh out of the fact that some people say, "Oh, I love your descriptions." If they only knew, because I mean, as I said, Fast Track went through 14 major revisions. I think it wasn't until like the 10th or 11th iteration that there's a scene near the end of the book that happens in a crowded diner on a Saturday morning, and there's just a lot of hubbub going on. Something happens, and the place just comes to a halt and no one says anything. And it wasn't until the rewrite that I heard the bacon and eggs sizzling on the grill.
mhm.
So uh, the hardest thing, at least initially, was being able to access those sensory details and those details about a scene that make it vivid and make it come alive. It's the show, don't tell part.
Do you think that writing those descriptions is gender specific? Does Lark see the world differently than you might or than a male character might?
Oh, definitely. Because one of the things I discovered in talking to my female friends is there was one woman at CNN. I said, what's it like for guys to come on to you all the time? And she said, and this was really eye opening, she said, I can determine in the first 20 seconds if it's safe. I never have to worry about whether it's safe. But
Hmm.
a woman, I discovered, is playing defense all the
Hmm.
time. And so that factors into Lark's psyche. A guy who's friendly, what's really going on here? So
Hmm.
she's much more skeptical than I ever am in a relationship or have been.
And so that's the type of thing, understanding a woman's sort of place in the world and how she navigates that impacts the description that you write and how she sees everything, really.
Yes, because she has trust issues with men, and so she sizes them up pretty quickly.
Hmm. Interesting. So you mentioned that Lark has a male mentor who's
Right.
older.
Yep.
How much of that character is you?
Well, sure. I mean, I'm old for number one, and I've got some experience as a journalist. So yeah, Lionel is a lot like me as well. Um, I think it's safe to say that all of us are in our characters, even the villains.
So when you're writing, do you find yourself going back to your years at CNN to pull situations and to remember events that happen and conversations and things like that?
Yes, there's one in particular. Um, Back in the day when CNN first started, the newsroom was the background for the anchor set. So it was a working newsroom, and the editors sat in the middle of a circular pod, and the writers and the producers sat on the outer rim, and there were four pods behind the anchors. And this was early in my career at CNN, and I was a writer, so I was on the outer rim, and I heard a conversation over my left shoulder between two female producers. One was producing the show that was going to be on shortly. The other had just produced a show and everything that could go wrong did go wrong.
Mhm.
So she was called into Mr. Big's office, and it was a male female dynamic, real power dynamic. And he just, took her apart. You're terrible. You're awful. You did this wrong. So now she's back in the newsroom telling her girlfriend about this story. And I'm listening. And at one point in the conversation, she said to her girlfriend, and I told myself, you will not cry. You will not cry. And I'm thinking to myself, if I were in that situation, I would have been saying to myself, you will not punch him out. You will not punch him out.
Yeah.
And so that bit of dialogue is plucked from reality. And when
Mhm.
Lark has an argument with Lionel, she's saying to herself, you will not cry. And I know it's authentic.
Yeah, that's interesting. Do you think that you understand women in general better now than you did before you started the series?
I do. I think I do. It's a learning curve. The my agent is a woman. That helps. I mentioned my friends, female friends, are beta readers. But one of the things that happened, oh man, I think it was when Troubled Water, my third novel, came out. A woman reviewed it. I did not know the woman, and she said, all right, I'll admit it. As soon as I saw that it was a guy writing as a woman, I couldn't wait to take this book apart. And she said, after the fifth page, I forgot that it was a man. And
That's great.
and she really gave it a glowing review, as she has for the subsequent ones. So, I know I can't please everybody. I'm sure that I mean, it's not perfect, but I'm pretty happy with the way I've accessed the female psyche. And Carol Costello, one of the anchors I worked with at CNN, she said, "You've got a really well developed female side." I said, "Is that a good thing?" She said, "That's a very good thing."
I think that's an amazing compliment. Both that compliment that you're tapped into that female psyche yourself and that's been observed, but then also the reviewer who was ready to take you down didn't. I think that's a huge compliment.
Yeah, and and I'm a straight male, so it's not like, there's any gender dysphoria going on here.
Mhm, mhm,
I'm pretty clear about who I am, but I think, Melissa, the thing I've learned, I think I'm a better man because of the sensitivity that I've learned over the years, to be sensitive to women and to listen to them.
mhm.
I think I think that's where men fail a lot. You know,
I agree, and I think that comes down to how society sees men, but also how parents parent their boys. I have four boys and one girl, and I parented my boys, my husband and I both, to be respectful and to understand their relationship to girls and to women as they grew up. And I find that they're, very upstanding, wonderful young men, but I
right,
think that that's in great part to how we intentionally parented them.
right, exactly, and uh, it's a learning curve, and I have a lot to learn. And we mentioned, not just other genders, but races and stuff like that. I was decades before I recognized that I was born on second base at a time when a lot of people didn't have the right to suit up. So I think I was late to realizing the privilege that
Hmm.
I had as a white male.
That's a good
Um,
analogy.
yeah.
Well, let's kind of wrap this up. And if you could give a couple of tips, some sort of specifics that writers can tap into or think about if they want to do what you've done and really dig in, whether it's a protagonist or another point of view character or whatever, um, how they can really do that as authentically as possible.
Whew. Whoa, how much time do we have? I
As much
think that
time as you like.
I think that there are a lot of things that people do. Number one is just recognize that you've got a passion to write. And that means then that if you've got the passion to write, then do your best to write better, to learn how to hone your craft, understand the business. If you want to get published, understand what the parameters are and what's required. Write every day. I journal every day. It's not writing my stories, but the pen keeps moving. It's a communication thing. I think you need to be alert and aware of your surroundings. Ask questions, get to know other people, because that is fueling your subconscious. And that's where your creativity is going to be coming from. I think you should go to writers' conferences. Writers' conferences are a great place to interact with people who are like you, because writing is a very solitary experience.
Mm-hmm.
And it's even harder because a lot of writers are either introverts or shy. So that means that I think it's important to get out there and realize you're not alone, and you can be encouraged by other writers, published authors. You can learn the craft by coming in contact with people uh, who know what they're talking about. And you just, you make friends. Um, be persistent. Don't give up. Don't get discouraged. If the passion is there, then it's just a matter of harnessing it and getting better and better until you find that sweet spot.
And when you're talking about specifically writing from a different perspective than your own, whether that's gender or race, ethnicity, have you found it easy to talk to other people? One thing that has come up in previous podcasts kind of related to this topic is that, you need to do your research. You can't just write from your own perspective and think that you have to talk to people. Have you found that to be easy, and that the women specifically that you spoke with at CNN that are your beta readers, et cetera, are, excited to share their experiences with you so that you get it right?
Here's what I've discovered. Part of it is knowing yourself. And I've discovered over the years that I am a shy extrovert with introvert tendencies.
I think I'm the same.
And this came to a head for me when I was covering the 19 I think it was the 1984 presidential election in New Hampshire, the New Hampshire primary. And I was, in Manchester, New Hampshire, on the main street, doing, at 6 in the morning, doing person on the street interviews. And it's basically, who are you going to vote for? It took me 20 minutes to get the courage to ask somebody, because I was afraid of being rejected, or, fake news or whatever.
Mhm.
So at first it wasn't easy. But what I've discovered is that if you have introvert or shy tendencies, that's daunting when it comes to interacting with someone. And so my suggestion, especially if this is you, ask questions, because as soon as you do, the spotlight is on the other person.
Right.
And when we give other people the permission to talk about themselves, they won't shut up.
Unless
And
they're shy also.
yeah, well, I mean, yes, but a shy person still has a lot going on.
Mhm.
And if they really sense that you're curious, then they really will blossom. I can't tell you the number of times that shy people especially, will say, I've never told this to anybody before. And we
Interesting.
just met.
Mhm.
um, because I'm curious. I'm relentlessly curious, which can be a blessing and a curse. Um, I've discovered, though, that two things I've discovered, and then I'll shut up. One is, um, I've been at like a cocktail party and I'm pummeling someone, just to get to know them. And then there's a point in the conversation where silence is golden and you shut up, and it's a great opportunity for the conversation to pivot, and they'll ask you a question. By this time, they're just waiting for the next question.
Yeah.
The other thing I've learned, and this is, my wife is an introvert, and I've been married 40 years. I think it was 40 years that it took me to realize she's an introvert, because she talks to me, but I only get 3 questions with her. And then she goes, and that's all I want to say about that. So she's one of my toughest interviews.
That's funny. Yeah, I have found that I'm the shy introvert, extrovert. What did you say? Introverted extrovert.
So
um,
I'm an ambivert.
there we go. And I'm great at asking open-ended questions.
Yeah,
But what I find is that, like you said, when that conversation might naturally pivot, yeah, you don't get asked questions in return. There isn't that
right.
reciprocity, which I find so interesting. And I'm okay with it, generally speaking. But on the other
Exactly.
hand, I think, why don't they want to know about me?
Exactly. Because you've put them on the pedestal.
Hmm.
Because look, I think that we live in a society that, you'd never know it when you look at politics, but I think for the most part, in interpersonal relationships, we're polite. We don't want to offend. We don't want to make people uncomfortable. Therefore, if you listen to conversations, we are great at skimming across the surface.
Hmm.
And what I tell my students, I give a class, I teach a class on interviewing. And I said, learn to go deep, because as soon as when you go deep, you've really given them permission to open up. But they need to know it's safe. They need to know that you're not going to be judgy.
Hmm.
Um, and once people are comfortable with that, you can really get to know someone on a much deeper level.
Okay, so that is your great advice for anybody wanting to write about something that's just outside of their normal area of expertise. Write what you know, yes, but you can't only write what you know. You've got to research. And so you've just got to figure out how to put yourself out there and ask those open ended questions. And I think once you start, it gets easier and easier and easier.
Absolutely, it does. And I'll say another thing about research, because I think that if you write, especially if you're writing historical fiction or something like that, um, you can. I think a lot of people never really get to the point where they're ready to write their first draft because they've never quite finished their research. And the point is that you can never know everything about everything. So you'll be down that rabbit hole forever.
Yeah.
And so my suggestion is write that first draft. And if there's something you don't know, you can do maybe a quick Google or Wikipedia search, but then get back to writing. And then if you hit a wall, put yourself in the situation and just try to figure it out, get all the way to the end, because that will identify what questions you really do need to ask to do your research. Your research will then be targeted to what the need is in the story, as opposed to finding out everything about everything.
Yeah. Great points. And I think also understanding what your character's goals are, and especially when you're talking men and women, sometimes their goals might be different or on different emotional
No,
levels. So you've
no.
got to understand, you need to understand what are Lark's goals emotionally as well as, the external plot.
Exactly. And I think at least in Lark's case, there's a lot of time where she's not sure.
Mhm.
She's still just trying to figure it out. And that's, I think, part of life too. We sometimes only have enough light for the next step.
Well, this has been such a great conversation, and I'm so
Thank you.
glad to have spoken with you about it. Tell us what is next. So, what book just came out, number 5, and then what's next for you?
Book 5 is called Fake. Lark is a White House correspondent. She is the victim of fake news, and it's also in the era of hashtag Me Too. So she's got a lot on her plate. Um, Book 6 is a work in progress. It takes place about 6 months, maybe even less than 6 months after Fake ends. So she's still in this White House maelstrom. She and the president are pretty good friends, actually, and that also makes for some complications. I would, I am still groping my way toward the end, but I think that abortion is going to be a part of it. I think that QAnon is probably going to be a factor, and I think mental illness will be, a plot device in there as well.
So, you
So
are
that's
hitting on a lot of important and timely topics.
Yeah, and then I've got a memoir that's in the fourth draft that is now in the hands of my beta readers. My main beta reader is my wife, which means it may never see the light of day.
Wow, that's great. So, your intent is to publish the memoir traditionally?
Well, my desire is,
Hmm.
but we'll see. I mean,
Hmm.
the working title is What Alfred Hitchcock Told Me and More: A Life of Plot Twists, pivotal moments in my life that brought me to where I am.
That's
Because
a great title.
life doesn't turn out the way you expect.
Never. It never does.
No,
Best laid plans, right? Well, thank
exactly.
you again for being here with us. I really, really appreciate it, and best of luck with everything. And I would love to have you back to talk about another topic sometime.
Thanks, Melissa. This has been fun.
Thanks for listening, everyone. I hope you enjoyed today's podcast with John DeDakis. If you're like me and like bookish and writerly products, check out the WriterSpark TeePublic store. Remember to like and subscribe to this podcast. And if you're checking us out on YouTube, subscribe there. Come back for more tips and tricks about fiction writing and learn more about our online courses at www.writersparkacademy.com. There is also a collection of resource books now, including the Fiction Writer's Character Bible, as well as Writing a Cozy Mystery Case Files, and a companion workbook. So check all of those things out at writersparkacademy.com. I'm Melissa Bourbon. Thank you for listening, and until next time, happy writing.